On a warm December afternoon in 1993, a man stood on a rooftop in Medellín, Colombia. He was barefoot, overweight, and clutching a 9mm pistol. Just moments earlier, he had been speaking on the phone to his teenage son, a call that Colombian and American intelligence agents had been desperately waiting for him to make. They had spent 16 months and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find him. And now, because he could not resist the urge to hear his boy's voice one more time, they had him. Gunfire erupted from the street below and from the surrounding rooftops. The man tried to run across the clay tiles. He was slow. He was heavy. He had spent the last year and a half hiding in safe houses, eating too much, sleeping too little, watching his empire crumble piece by piece. He made it only a few steps before 2 bullets struck his torso. He stumbled. A third bullet entered just behind his right ear. He collapsed face down on the warm tiles, his blood pooling in the afternoon sun. The man on the rooftop was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. He was 44 years old. At the peak of his power, Forbes magazine had listed him as the 7th richest person on Earth. He had smuggled an estimated 80% of all the cocaine consumed in the United States. He had ordered the assassination of 3 presidential candidates, blown up a commercial airliner carrying 107 innocent people, and bombed the headquarters of Colombia's secret police. He had murdered judges, journalists, police officers, and politicians. Thousands of people had died because of his orders. And yet, in the slums of Medellín, tens of thousands of people would mourn him. They would weep in the streets. They would carry his coffin on their shoulders through neighborhoods he had built for them. Because Pablo Escobar was not simply a drug lord. He was something far more complicated. He was a monster who built hospitals, a killer who funded schools, a terrorist who was worshipped as a saint. This is his complete story. Not the Netflix version, not the simplified headlines. This is the full, unvarnished life of the most powerful criminal in modern history, told from beginning to end. Get comfortable, settle in, turn the lights down low. This story begins not on a rooftop in Medellín, but in a small, forgotten town in the Green Mountains of Colombia, where a boy with enormous ambitions was about to discover that the world had no intention of giving him what he wanted. Pablo Escobar was born on December 1st, 1949, in the small town of Rionegro, nestled in the lush green highlands of Antioquia, a mountainous department in northwestern Colombia. The Antioquia region had a distinct cultural identity. Its people, known as Paisas, were fiercely proud, deeply Catholic, and famously entrepreneurial. They valued hard work, family loyalty, and self-reliance above almost everything else. These values would shape Pablo Escobar in ways that would prove both extraordinary and catastrophic. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a school teacher with a fierce personality and a deep belief in education. She was the backbone of the family, a woman who kept the household running through sheer willpower. His father, Abel de Jesus Escobar Echeverri, was a peasant farmer who worked a modest plot of land outside Rionegro. He was a quiet, hard-working man who never sought attention or conflict. In later years, when Pablo had become the most famous criminal on the planet, Abel would remain largely invisible, a shadow in the background of his son's enormous and terrifying story. Pablo was the third of 7 children. The family was neither wealthy nor desperately poor. They occupied that vast, overlooked space in Colombian society where millions of families existed without any real hope of upward mobility. Colombia in the 1950s and 60s was a country of extreme inequality. A tiny elite controlled the land, the economy, the judiciary, and the political system. For families like the Escobars, the legitimate path to prosperity was essentially non-existent. You were born into your station, and you stayed there. When Pablo was still a young child, the family relocated to the suburb of Envigado, just south of Medellín. Envigado was a working-class neighborhood of concrete block houses with tin roofs, narrow streets, and small corner shops. The move was driven by Hermilda's desire to provide better schooling for her children. Medellín, Colombia's second-largest city, offered opportunities that the rural highlands did not. But it also offered something else, something that would prove far more consequential for young Pablo. It offered proximity to the criminal underworld. Medellín in the 1960s was a city of stark contrasts. The wealthy lived in the elevated neighborhoods to the south and east, in spacious homes with gardens and views of the valley below. The poor lived in the comunas, the sprawling hillside slums that clung to the steep mountainsides like concrete barnacles. These neighborhoods had no running water, no sewage systems, and limited electricity. Violence was routine. The police were either absent or corrupt. And for young men growing up in these communities, the legitimate economy offered almost nothing. The factories paid poverty wages. The universities were effectively closed to anyone without connections or money. The government provided no social safety net whatsoever. In this environment, crime was not merely tempting, it was rational. The risk-reward calculation was simple. A life of honest labor would yield decades of grinding poverty, while a single successful criminal venture could produce more money than your father had earned in his entire lifetime. Pablo Escobar understood this calculus at a remarkably young age. As a teenager, Pablo attended the Liceo de la Universidad de Antioquia, a local secondary school. He was an indifferent student. He was not unintelligent. Those who knew him would later describe a quick, calculating mind, with an exceptional memory for numbers and names. But the formal curriculum bored him. He was far more interested in the education available on the streets of Envigado, where a shadow economy of petty crime, contraband, and hustle operated in plain sight. His first criminal ventures were small and almost comically unglamorous. He stole tombstones from local cemeteries, chiseled off the engraved names, and resold the blank stones to new buyers. It was a disgusting little business, but it revealed something fundamental about his character. He was willing to do things that other people found repulsive. He could look at a graveyard and see inventory. He could separate sentiment from opportunity with a coldness that most teenagers simply did not possess. From tombstones, he graduated to stealing cars. He would strip them for parts and sell the components individually, earning several times what the intact car would have fetched. Then he moved into small-scale contraband, smuggling cigarettes and liquor across municipal boundaries to avoid local taxes. Each venture was slightly larger, slightly more profitable, and slightly more dangerous than the last. He was climbing a ladder, rung by rung, and he showed no sign of wanting to stop. By his late teens, Pablo had assembled a small crew of associates from the neighborhoods around Envigado. They were young men like himself, ambitious, impatient, and unimpressed by the promises of legitimate society. Together, they began engaging in more serious criminal activity, including armed robbery and, eventually, kidnapping. In 1971, when Pablo was 21 years old, he and several associates kidnapped a prominent Medellín industrialist named Diego Echevarria Misas. Echevarria was a wealthy textile manufacturer, the kind of man who represented everything that the young men of Envigado resented about Colombian society: inherited privilege, political connections, and a casual indifference to the suffering of the poor. The ransom demand was substantial. When negotiations stalled, Echevarria was killed. His body was found weeks later in a shallow grave. The kidnapping of Diego Echevarria was a turning point. Not because it was particularly successful, the ransom was apparently never paid in full, but because it demonstrated that Pablo Escobar was capable of lethal violence. He had crossed a threshold that most petty criminals never cross. He had proven to himself and to his associates that he would kill if the situation demanded it. And once that line had been crossed, there was no going back. But kidnapping, while dramatic, was an inefficient criminal enterprise. It was messy, dangerous, and attracted enormous attention from law enforcement. It created enemies among the wealthy and powerful, precisely the people you did not want to antagonize in a country like Colombia. Pablo needed something different, something with higher margins, lower visibility, and the potential for truly massive scale. And in the mid-1970s, that something arrived. To understand how Pablo Escobar became the most powerful drug trafficker in history, you first have to understand the cocaine trade as it existed before he transformed it. In the early 1970s, cocaine was a niche product. It was popular in certain circles: Hollywood actors, Wall Street traders, rock musicians. But it had not yet penetrated the mass market. The supply chain was fragmented and amateurish. Small-time operators in Colombia and Bolivia would produce modest quantities of cocaine in jungle laboratories, then attempt to smuggle it into the United States using the crudest possible methods: suitcases with false bottoms, hollowed-out shoes, and human couriers who swallowed condoms filled with powder and prayed that none of them burst during the flight. The profits were astonishing, even at this primitive scale. A kilogram of cocaine that cost approximately $1,500 to $2,000 to produce in Colombia could be sold on the streets of Miami, New York, or Los Angeles for anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000. That markup, roughly 3,000%, was unlike anything in the legitimate economy. It was, by any rational measure, the most profitable commodity trade in the history of the world. But the business was chaotic. Shipments were frequently lost or intercepted. Couriers were unreliable. Distribution networks in the United States were controlled by a patchwork of small-time dealers with no coordination between them. What the cocaine trade desperately needed was what any burgeoning industry needs: professional management, reliable logistics, and economies of scale. Pablo Escobar would provide all three. His entry into the cocaine business began modestly. In the mid-70s, he started purchasing coca paste from suppliers in Peru and Bolivia, processing it in small jungle laboratories, and arranging for its transport to the United States. His earliest smuggling methods were rudimentary, hiding cocaine in the spare tires of cars, in shipments of clothing, and in the luggage of paid couriers on commercial flights. But even these small operations generated enormous returns, and Pablo immediately began reinvesting his profits into expanding the business. What set Escobar apart from other traffickers was not his willingness to break the law. Everyone in the trade was doing that, but his extraordinary organizational talent. He thought about cocaine the way a corporate executive thinks about a consumer product. He obsessed over supply chain efficiency, quality control, distribution logistics, and market expansion. He identified bottlenecks and eliminated them. He found unreliable partners and replaced them. He invested in infrastructure with the same discipline that a legitimate businessman would invest in factories and warehouses. By the late 1970s, Pablo had assembled what would become known as the Medellín cartel. The term was somewhat misleading. It was not a single, hierarchical organization with a formal chain of command. It was more accurately described as a federation of independent traffickers who cooperated on logistics, shared transportation routes, and occasionally pooled resources for large shipments. The key figures alongside Escobar included the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio, who came from a wealthy ranching family and brought social respectability and financial sophistication to the operation. There was Carlos Later Rivas, a flamboyant German Colombian who had the revolutionary idea of using small private aircraft instead of commercial flights, dramatically increasing the volume that could be moved in each shipment. And there was José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, a brutal enforcer from the emerald mining regions of Boyacá, who handled the cartel's security and military operations. But Pablo was the visionary. He was the one who understood, before anyone else, that the cocaine trade could be scaled to industrial proportions. He purchased a fleet of Cessna aircraft and Piper planes. He built clandestine airstrips deep in the Colombian and Nicaraguan jungles. He developed submarine and semi-submersible routes through the Caribbean. He pioneered new concealment methods, hiding cocaine inside shipments of frozen fish paste, inside hollowed-out lumber, inside ceramic tiles, inside canned goods, inside industrial machinery. He established a network of corruption so vast that it touched nearly every institution in Colombia: the police, the military, the judiciary, the customs service, the banking system, and the political establishment at every level, from local mayors to national senators. The scale of the operation eventually became almost unfathomable. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the Medellín cartel was responsible for supplying approximately 80% of the cocaine consumed in the United States and a substantial portion of the European market. They were moving an estimated 70 to 80 metric tons of cocaine per month. The gross revenue flowing through the organization was estimated at between $25 and $30 billion per year. To put that figure in perspective, it exceeded the gross domestic product of most Central American and Caribbean nations combined. The cash itself became a logistical problem. So much currency was pouring in that it could not be counted by hand with sufficient speed. Escobar's organization began weighing money instead of counting it, using the known weight of standard bill denominations to estimate totals. Stacks of cash were stored in warehouses, buried in fields and hillsides, hidden inside the walls of houses, stuffed into barrels and sunk in rivers, and deposited in dozens of bank accounts across multiple countries under layers of shell companies and false names. Escobar reportedly spent more than $2,500 per month simply on rubber bands to wrap bundles of currency. He later estimated that approximately 10% of his cash holdings were lost each year to water damage, rats, and simple misplacement. 10% of $30 billion. He was losing $3 billion a year to rodents and rain, and it did not meaningfully affect his bottom line. And the money had to go somewhere visible too. Pablo began acquiring assets at a pace that defied belief. He purchased more than 15 residential properties in Medellín alone. He bought luxury apartments in Bogotá. He acquired dozens of ranches across the Colombian countryside, totaling hundreds of thousands of acres. He purchased fleets of cars, boats, helicopters, and aircraft. He imported exotic animals from Africa and Asia. And then he built the estate that would become the most extravagant symbol of narco wealth in history. Hacienda Nápoles was a 7,000-acre compound located along the Magdalena River Highway between Medellín and Bogotá. The entrance was marked by a gate above which was mounted the Piper PA-18 Super Cub airplane that Escobar claimed had carried his first major cocaine shipment to the United States. Beyond the gate lay a private kingdom. There were artificial lakes stocked with exotic fish. There were multiple swimming pools, including one with a wave machine. There was a go-kart track, a bullfighting ring, a sculpture garden, and a collection of vintage cars that included vehicles once owned by Al Capone and Bonnie and Clyde. There was a full-sized dinosaur park featuring life-sized concrete replicas of Tyrannosaurus rex, Brontosaurus, and Pterodactyl. But the most famous feature of Hacienda Nápoles was the zoo. Escobar had illegally imported elephants, giraffes, ostriches, zebras, camels, and hippopotamuses from Africa. The animals roamed the grounds freely, visible from the highway, astonishing motorists who could not quite believe what they were seeing. It was a pharaonic display of wealth, a monument to one man's ability to bend the world to his will. And it was funded entirely by cocaine. As Pablo Escobar's wealth grew to almost incomprehensible proportions, he began to cultivate something that money alone cannot buy: popular legitimacy. He had grown up in poverty. He had seen firsthand the indifference of the Colombian elite to the suffering of the poor. And whether out of genuine compassion, cynical calculation, or some inseparable mixture of both, he decided to position himself as a champion of the people. His philanthropic campaign began in the early 1980s and was breathtaking in its scope. In the hillside slums of Medellín, where families lived in shacks made of scrap wood and plastic sheeting, Escobar funded the construction of an entire neighborhood. It was called Barrio Pablo Escobar, a development of 500 small but solid brick houses, each with running water, electricity, and a concrete foundation. Families who had spent their entire lives living in garbage dumps were given homes with their own front doors. For these families, Pablo Escobar had done in months what the Colombian government had failed to do in decades. He built soccer fields with floodlights in neighborhoods that had never had a single functioning streetlight. He constructed roller skating rinks, basketball courts, and community centers. He donated money to local churches and funded the construction of new ones. He paid for school supplies, uniforms, and tuition for children whose parents could not afford them. He opened food distribution centers. He hired doctors and nurses to staff free clinics in communities where the nearest hospital was hours away by bus. He also distributed cash directly. He would drive through poor neighborhoods in a convoy of vehicles, stopping to hand out bills to anyone who approached. He attended community events, christenings, and funerals. He paid for elaborate Christmas celebrations, complete with fireworks and gifts for every child. He sponsored local soccer teams, buying them uniforms and equipment and attending their matches, cheering from the sidelines like any other proud sponsor. The effect of this generosity was profound and lasting. In the comunas of Medellín, Pablo Escobar was not a drug trafficker. He was a benefactor. He was the man who had remembered the forgotten. He was, in the eyes of thousands of families, nothing less than a secular saint. His photograph hung in living rooms next to images of the Virgin Mary and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. When his enemies would later try to turn the people of Medellín against him, they would discover that this loyalty ran deeper than fear, deeper than reason, deeper than anything the state had ever inspired. But charity alone was not enough to satisfy Pablo's ambitions. He wanted formal political power. He wanted to be recognized not just as a generous patron of the poor, but as a legitimate political figure with the authority and immunity that such a position would provide. In 1982, he made his move. He ran for the Colombian Chamber of Representatives as a substitute member, an alternate representative for the Liberal Party in the Department of Antioquia. His campaign was lavish. He spent freely, distributed gifts, and made promises of continued investment in public works. He won. Pablo Escobar, the head of the largest cocaine trafficking organization in the world, now held a seat in the Colombian Congress. He received a diplomatic passport. He traveled to the United States and posed for photographs outside the White House. For a brief, surreal moment, the most powerful drug lord in history was a duly elected member of a democratic legislature. But Pablo's political career attracted scrutiny that he had not anticipated. A young, ambitious justice minister named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began investigating Escobar's background. Lara was courageous, principled, and either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily foolish, perhaps both. He stood on the floor of the Colombian Congress and publicly denounced Escobar, presenting evidence linking him to the cocaine trade. He displayed photographs. He cited police records. He demanded that Escobar be expelled. Simultaneously, the newspaper El Espectador, one of Colombia's oldest and most respected publications, obtained and published Escobar's 1976 mugshot from an old drug arrest. The photograph appeared on the front page. The caption identified him as a narcotics trafficker. The pretense of legitimacy was shattered. Pablo was expelled from Congress. His diplomatic passport was revoked. His carefully constructed political persona collapsed. He was humiliated publicly in the newspapers, on television, in front of the entire nation. And humiliation was something that Pablo Escobar could not tolerate. It was, for him, worse than imprisonment, worse than poverty, perhaps even worse than death. When Pablo felt humiliated, people died. On April the 30th, 1984, two men on a motorcycle pulled alongside the car of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla on a busy Bogotá street. The passenger on the motorcycle raised a submachine gun and fired through the car window. Lara Bonilla was killed instantly. He was 37 years old. He left behind a wife and two young children. Pablo Escobar had sent a message to the Colombian state: "Oppose me, and you will die." It was the opening shot of a war that would last nearly a decade and claim thousands of lives. To understand Pablo Escobar fully, it is necessary to examine not just the public figure, the drug lord, the politician, the terrorist, but the private man. Because behind the headlines and the body count, there was a husband, a father, a son, and a brother who lived a domestic life of startling, almost absurd normality. Pablo married Maria Victoria Henao in 1976, when she was just 15 years old, and he was 26. The relationship had been controversial from the beginning. Maria Victoria's family, a respectable middle-class household in Envigado, had initially opposed the match. They knew that Pablo was involved in criminal activity, and they feared for their daughter's future. But Maria Victoria was infatuated, and Pablo, for all his brutality in the professional sphere, could be extraordinarily charming and attentive in his personal relationships. He wooed her with gifts, with promises, and with the kind of concentrated attention that few teenage girls can resist. They married against her family's wishes, and she would remain by his side for the next 17 years, through wealth beyond imagination and terror beyond description. Their first child, Juan Pablo, who would later change his name to Sebastian Marroquin, was born in 1977. A daughter, Manuela, followed in 1984. Pablo was, by virtually all accounts, a devoted and attentive father. He played with his children, he helped with homework, he attended school events, he read bedtime stories. He was patient, affectionate, and deeply concerned with their education and well-being. The contrast between the man who tucked his children into bed at night and the man who ordered car bombings in the morning was so extreme as to seem pathological. He was also deeply attached to his mother, Hermilda. She remained a central figure in his life throughout his career, and he visited her regularly, even during the most dangerous periods of his reign. Hermilda, for her part, never publicly condemned her son's activities. She maintained until her death in 2006 that Pablo was a good man who had been persecuted by a corrupt and unjust government. Whether she truly believed this or simply could not bear to confront the alternative is a question that died with her. Pablo's personal habits were, for a man of his wealth, surprisingly modest in some respects. He did not drink alcohol excessively. He did not use cocaine, an irony that was not lost on those who knew him. He ate simple Colombian food: beans, rice, grilled meat, arepas. His one indulgence was marijuana, which he consumed regularly. He dressed casually, preferring jeans and casual shirts to the flashy designer clothing favored by many of his associates. He was superstitious. He consulted fortune tellers and astrologers. He believed in the protective power of certain Catholic saints and carried religious medallions. But beneath this surface of domestic normality, there was a darkness that no amount of family devotion could conceal. Pablo was unfaithful to his wife on a scale that bordered on compulsive. He maintained relationships with numerous women simultaneously. He kept mistresses in apartments across Medellín. One of his most documented relationships was with Virginia Vallejo, a famous Colombian television journalist who became his lover in the early 1980s and later wrote a memoir about their affair. Vallejo described Pablo as simultaneously magnetic and terrifying, a man who could whisper poetry one moment and order a killing the next. He was also, in the privacy of his own organization, capable of extraordinary cruelty toward people who had once been his closest allies. Loyalty was everything to Pablo, and any perceived betrayal was met with swift and brutal punishment. Associates who skimmed money were tortured, informants were eliminated, rivals were removed along with their families. The same man who built houses for strangers in the slums could order the death of a lifelong friend without visible emotion. This duality, the loving father and the cold-blooded killer, the generous philanthropist and the merciless tyrant, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Pablo Escobar's character. It would be easier, psychologically, if he had been simply a monster. Monsters are simple, they are evil, and they do evil things. And when they die, the world is straightforwardly better. But Pablo Escobar was not simple. He was a man of genuine affections and genuine cruelty, of real generosity and real savagery. And the fact that these qualities coexisted within a single human being is what makes his story not just compelling, but deeply disturbing. Pablo Escobar's philosophy of dealing with authorities could be summarized in a single phrase that would become his trademark: plata o plomo, silver or lead, accept my bribe or accept my bullet. There was no third option. For much of the 1980s, this simple calculus worked devastatingly well. But Escobar's primary political objective during this period was singular and obsessive: the elimination of the extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States. This treaty, signed in 1979, allowed Colombian drug traffickers to be tried in American courts, where their money and influence were worthless. An American prison was the one thing Pablo Escobar feared more than anything else on earth. He knew that in Colombia, his billions could buy judges, bribe guards, and ensure comfortable conditions even behind bars. In the United States, he would be just another inmate in a concrete cell. To fight extradition, Escobar founded a group called Los Extraditables, a coalition of drug traffickers who shared his terror of American justice. Their slogan was chilling in its simplicity: Preferimos una tumba en Colombia a una celda en Estados Unidos. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison cell in the United States. And they meant it. The campaign of violence that followed was staggering in its ambition, its brutality, and its disregard for human life. In November of 1985, a group of guerrillas from the M19 movement stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, the seat of Colombia's Supreme Court. They took hundreds of hostages, including 25 Supreme Court justices. The Colombian military responded with overwhelming force, sending tanks and armored personnel carriers into the building. The resulting siege lasted 27 hours. When it was over, more than 100 people were dead, including 11 of the 25 Supreme Court justices. Critical case files related to extradition were destroyed in the fires that consumed the building. While the M19 guerrillas were the direct perpetrators, extensive evidence later emerged, suggesting that Pablo Escobar had financed the attack, paying the guerrillas $2 million to destroy the extradition files. In December of 1986, Escobar's men assassinated Guillermo Cano y Sasa, the editor-in-chief of El Espectador, the newspaper that had published his mugshot 2 years earlier. Cano was shot by a gunman outside the newspaper's offices in Bogotá. He was 60 years old and had spent his career fighting for press freedom in one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. In January of 1988, the cartel kidnapped Andres Pastrana Arango, a prominent journalist and politician who would later become president of Colombia. Pastrana was held for several days before being released, presumably after backroom negotiations. The kidnapping demonstrated that absolutely no one in Colombian public life was beyond Escobar's reach. In August of 1989, the violence escalated to a level that stunned even a nation accustomed to bloodshed. Luis Carlos Galán, the leading candidate for the Colombian presidency and a fierce advocate of extradition, was assassinated at a political rally in the town of Soacha, just outside Bogotá. Galán was shot multiple times as he stood on a raised platform before a crowd of thousands. He was 46 years old. He had been widely expected to win the presidency, and his death sent shockwaves through Colombian society. The assassination was so brazen, so public, and so devastating that it forced the Colombian government to respond. President Virgilio Barco Vargas reinstated extradition by emergency decree and launched a massive crackdown on the Medellín cartel. Escobar's response was to escalate further. On November 27, 1989, his operatives planted a bomb aboard Avianca Flight 203, a Boeing 727 traveling from Bogotá to Cali. The device detonated shortly after takeoff, killing all 107 passengers and crew members. The intended target was Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, who had taken up the mantle of the anti-cartel presidential campaign after Galán's assassination. Gaviria was not on the plane. He had changed his travel plans at the last minute based on a security tip. 107 people died because Pablo Escobar wanted to kill one man who was not even there. Less than 3 weeks later, on December 6, 1989, a truck loaded with approximately 500 kilograms of dynamite was detonated outside the headquarters of the DAS, Colombia's equivalent of the FBI and Secret Service combined. The explosion was felt miles away. 52 people were killed, and over 600 were injured. Surrounding buildings collapsed. Cars were thrown into the air. The crater left in the street was large enough to swallow a bus. Between 1989 and 1993, Escobar's organization carried out more than 200 bombings in Colombian cities. Car bombs, pipe bombs, and dynamite attacks targeted shopping centers, banks, newspaper offices, and government buildings. He placed bounties on police officers in Medellín, offering between 1 and 2 million Colombian pesos, roughly $500 to $1,000, for each officer killed. Young men from the slums, the same communities where Pablo had built soccer fields and housing, lined up to collect. More than 500 Medellín police officers were murdered during this period. The terror campaign achieved its objective. The Colombian public, exhausted by years of bombings and assassinations, pressured the government to negotiate. In 1991, a new constitution was drafted and ratified. Among its provisions was a prohibition on the extradition of Colombian citizens. Pablo Escobar had bombed, murdered, and terrorized his way to a constitutional amendment. And now, with extradition off the table, he was ready to make a deal. On June 19, 1991, Pablo Escobar surrendered to Colombian authorities. The terms of his surrender were, by any objective standard, absurd. He would be confined to a purpose-built facility called La Catedral, located on a mountainside in the municipality of Envigado, his childhood home. The facility had been constructed to Escobar's own specifications, on land that he owned, and would be guarded by personnel that he had personally selected. No Colombian military or police forces would be permitted within a defined perimeter around the prison. In essence, the Colombian government had allowed the most wanted man in the world to design, build, and staff his own prison. La Catedral was a prison in name only. Situated at an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, it offered sweeping panoramic views of the Medellín Valley below. The facility featured multiple bedrooms with king-sized beds, a full bar stocked with imported liquor, a jacuzzi, a sauna, and a discotheque with a professional sound system and dance floor. There was a soccer field, a private office, and a fully equipped kitchen staffed by personal chefs. Escobar had a personal gymnasium, a library, and satellite television. He wore designer clothing. He ate gourmet meals. He received visitors freely: business associates, friends, family members, lawyers, and, according to multiple accounts, women who were brought to the facility for his entertainment. More importantly, Escobar continued to run his criminal empire from within La Catedral. He conducted business meetings in his office, issued orders via telephone and radio, managed cocaine shipments, collected debts, and resolved disputes among his associates. He was, for all practical purposes, operating exactly as he had before his surrender, with the added benefit of being protected from both the Colombian military and rival traffickers by the walls of his own luxurious fortress. For 13 months, this extraordinary arrangement persisted. The Colombian government, embarrassed but seemingly powerless, looked the other way. International observers expressed disbelief. The United States government, which had spent hundreds of millions of dollars supporting Colombia's war against the cartels, watched in frustration. But in July of 1992, the arrangement collapsed. Reports emerged that Escobar had ordered the kidnapping and murder of 2 of his own associates, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, both senior Medellín cartel figures, inside La Catedral itself. The men had been summoned to the prison, accused of stealing money from Escobar, and executed. Their bodies were reportedly buried on the prison grounds. The murders forced the government to act. President Cesar Gaviria, the man who had survived the Avianca bombing, ordered Escobar's transfer to a conventional military prison. On the night of July the 22nd, 1992, soldiers arrived at La Catedral to carry out the transfer. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts describe a comedy of errors involving confused soldiers and deliberately misleading prison staff, but the result was clear. By the time the military had secured the facility, Pablo Escobar was gone. He had walked out through a gap in the perimeter fence and vanished into the mountains above Medellín. The most wanted man in the world was free again. And this time, the Colombian government would not make the mistake of offering him comfortable terms. The hunt for Pablo Escobar after his escape from La Catedral was the most intensive, expensive, and technologically sophisticated manhunt in history up to that point. The Colombian government established a special unit called the Bloc de Búsqueda, or Search Block, composed of elite police and military personnel specifically tasked with finding and capturing, or killing, Escobar. The unit was supported by the United States government, which deployed personnel from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and, according to some accounts, operators from the Army's Delta Force and the Navy's SEAL teams. American electronic surveillance technology was critical to the hunt. The NSA provided sophisticated radio direction finding equipment capable of triangulating the source of telephone and radio transmissions. CIA operatives provided intelligence analysis and coordination. DEA agents worked alongside their Colombian counterparts on the ground. The total American investment in the hunt for Escobar is believed to have exceeded $500 million. But there was another force hunting Pablo Escobar, one far less constrained by legal niceties. A shadowy vigilante organization calling itself Los Pepes, an acronym for Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged in early 1993. Los Pepes systematically targeted everything connected to Escobar. His properties were burned, his businesses were destroyed, his lawyers were threatened or killed, his relatives were harassed, and his associates were murdered. The group operated with a ruthless efficiency that suggested professional training and excellent intelligence. The membership and sponsorship of Los Pepes has never been definitively established, but evidence strongly suggests involvement by the rival Cali cartel, disaffected former members of Escobar's own organization, right-wing paramilitary commanders, and possibly elements within the Colombian security forces themselves. Some investigators have alleged that American intelligence personnel were aware of Los Pepes' activities and, at minimum, did nothing to stop them. As the months dragged on, Escobar's world shrank. His properties were seized or destroyed, his bank accounts were frozen, his associates were killed or arrested one by one. His family was harassed and eventually forced to seek refuge in the Intercontinental Hotel in Bogotá under government protection. He moved constantly, rarely spending more than 1 or 2 nights in the same safe house. He grew a beard. He gained weight. He trusted almost no one. But he could not stop calling his family. Despite everything, despite the surveillance, despite the tracking technology, despite the certain knowledge that every call brought his hunters closer, Pablo Escobar called his wife and children almost every day. He was, beneath the violence and the billions and the megalomania, a man who loved his family with a fierce, almost desperate intensity. His son, Juan Pablo, later described these calls as lifelines for both father and son, brief moments of normalcy in an existence that had become pure nightmare. Pablo would ask about homework. He would discuss soccer. He would tell his children he loved them. And with each call, the electronic net drew tighter. By late November of 1993, the search block's electronic surveillance capability had advanced to the point where they could pinpoint a phone signal within a matter of minutes. They were listening constantly, waiting for Pablo to make the one call he could not resist making. On December the 2nd, 1993, he made it. Shortly after noon, Pablo telephoned his son Juan Pablo from a 2-story house in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellín called Los Olivos. The conversation lasted approximately 6 minutes. It was enough. The surveillance team triangulated his position within minutes and relayed the coordinates to the search block, which had units positioned throughout the city. A team of Colombian Special Forces operators converged on the house. When they breached the front door, Pablo and his lone remaining bodyguard, a man known as El Limón, attempted to escape through a second-floor window and across the rooftop. Gunfire erupted immediately. El Limón was killed on the window ledge. Pablo made it onto the roof tiles, running barefoot in his stockinged feet, his belly straining against a blue polo shirt. He did not make it far. Multiple rounds struck his body. He fell on the clay tiles, his pistol still in his hand. The bullet that killed him entered behind his right ear and exited through his face. Whether that fatal shot was fired by a Colombian soldier, by a member of Los Pepes who had embedded with the search block, or by Escobar himself, he had always sworn he would never be taken alive, remains a subject of debate that will likely never be resolved. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was declared dead at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon on December the 2nd, 1993. He was 44 years old. The photographs of Escobar's body were broadcast around the world within hours of his death. He lay on his back on the rooftop, his face partially destroyed by the exit wound, his belly exposed, his bare feet pale against the orange clay tiles. Colombian police officers posed for photographs next to his corpse, grinning and flashing victory signs. In Washington and Bogotá, government officials issued statements of satisfaction. The hunt was over. The monster was dead. But the death of Pablo Escobar solved very little. The cocaine trade did not slow down. It did not even pause. Within weeks of his death, the Cali cartel, headed by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers Gilberto and Miguel, had absorbed most of Escobar's trafficking routes and distribution networks. Within a few years, after the Cali cartel itself was dismantled, Mexican trafficking organizations rose to fill the vacuum, eventually becoming even more powerful and more violent than the Colombian cartels had ever been. The Sinaloa Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Each of these organizations can trace its lineage, in one way or another, to the infrastructure and methods that Pablo Escobar pioneered. The cocaine continued to flow north, American demand remained insatiable, and the cycle of violence, corruption, and interdiction that Escobar had profited from continued to consume lives on both sides of the border, year after year, decade after decade. In Medellín, the reaction to Escobar's death was complex and deeply divided. In the wealthy neighborhoods, there was relief. The bombings were over. The assassinations would stop. The city could begin to heal. But in the comunas, in the hillside slums where Pablo had built houses and soccer fields and given people a reason to believe that someone cared about them, there was genuine grief. Thousands of people attended his funeral. Mourners wept openly. His coffin was carried through the streets by people who considered him not a criminal, but a savior. Some fainted. Some screamed his name. The police stayed at a distance, unwilling to confront the depth of emotion. His family scattered after his death. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and his two children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, fled Colombia in early 1994, seeking asylum in multiple countries before eventually settling in Argentina under assumed names. Juan Pablo changed his name to Sebastian Marroquin and pursued a degree in architecture. He later wrote a memoir titled Pablo Escobar, My Father, in which he attempted to reconcile his love for the man who raised him with his understanding of the unspeakable crimes that man had committed. He has spent much of his adult life publicly denouncing his father's legacy and advocating for peace, while acknowledging the impossibility of fully escaping the shadow of the Escobar name. Manuela, Escobar's daughter, has lived almost entirely out of public view. She has given no interviews and has avoided any association with her father's legacy. She remains, by all accounts, deeply traumatized by her childhood experiences. Maria Victoria, Pablo's widow, was eventually charged with money laundering by Argentine authorities and spent time under house arrest before the charges were dropped. She has described her years with Pablo as a combination of extraordinary privilege and constant terror, a life in which limitless wealth coexisted with the daily possibility of violent death. Hacienda Nápoles, the legendary estate, was seized by the Colombian government after Escobar's death. The property fell into disrepair. The exotic animals were relocated to zoos across Colombia, all except the hippos. The 4 hippopotamuses that Escobar had imported from Africa in the 1980s escaped from their enclosures and made their way into the Magdalena River and its tributaries. In the warm, predator-free waters of Colombia, they thrived. They bred. By the mid-2000s, there were dozens. By the 2020s, there were estimated to be more than 150 feral hippos living in the waterways of central Colombia, the largest wild population of hippos outside of Africa. They have become an ecological problem, disrupting local ecosystems and occasionally threatening the safety of fishermen and farmers. They are, in a strange and unintended way, Pablo Escobar's most enduring legacy, a living monument to the fact that the consequences of one man's actions can persist long after that man is gone. Pablo Escobar lived for 44 years. In that brief span, he accumulated more wealth than most nations, killed more people than most wars, and left a mark on his country and his continent that is yet to fade. He was a father who loved his children and a man who murdered other people's children without hesitation. He was a philanthropist who built houses for the poor and a terrorist who bombed buildings full of innocent people. He was worshipped as a saint and hunted as a monster, and he was, in truth, both of those things simultaneously. His story is not a simple morality tale about crime and punishment. It is a story about a broken society and the kind of man that broken societies produce. It is a story about poverty and ambition, about corruption and power, about the limits of state authority and the terrifying capabilities of a single individual with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. It is a story that Colombia is still living with, still processing, still trying to understand. And it is a story worth remembering. Not because Pablo Escobar deserves to be remembered as a hero. He does not. But because the conditions that created him, the poverty, the inequality, the corruption, the insatiable demand for drugs in wealthy nations, have not been resolved. They persist. And as long as they persist, the story of Pablo Escobar will remain not just history, but prophecy. Thank you for listening. If you are still awake, I hope this story gave you something to think about as you close your eyes tonight. And if you have already fallen asleep, then this documentary has done exactly what it was designed to do. Either way, good night. Subscribe to Bedtime Crimes for more long-form true crime documentaries designed for sleep. New videos every week. Next time, we explore the life of another infamous figure who changed history from the shadows. Sweet dreams.